The night was supposed to be quiet, at least by combat standards. The squad had returned from a grueling 12-hour patrol in the valley, their boots caked with dust, their shoulders stiff from carrying gear that always felt heavier on the way back. They were bone-tired, half running on adrenaline, half on fumes. The outpost sat in a shallow cut between two ridges, just HESCO barriers, sandbags and plywood huts. But to them it was home for the night. Private Hayes was halfway through unstrapping his vest when the first blast hit. The shockwave rattled the flimsy walls, knocking coffee mugs off shelves. A dull boom echoed across the mountains, followed by the sickening hiss of incoming fire. Mortars. Not random potshots either, these were coordinated, dialed in. The first one had landed 50 meters short, but the second was dead on. Contact. Indirect. Incoming. Sergeant Miller's voice cut through the chaos, commanding and sharp. Soldiers scrambled, grabbing helmets, weapons, anything within reach. Hayes threw himself into the dirt, the fine Afghan dust filling his nose and mouth as he prayed the next round wouldn't have his name on it. Then came the third. It tore through the thin plywood of the comm shack and exploded inside, turning equipment into twisted shards. The fireball lit the compound for a split second, followed by the screams of the two men inside. That sound, that human sound, was always worse than the blast itself. Specialist Torres didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the flames even as more mortars whistled down. "We gotta pull him out," he shouted, disappearing into the smoke. It was suicide and everyone knew it. Yet Sergeant Miller followed, barking at the rest of the squad to provide cover. Hayes stayed low, heart pounding, torn between self-preservation and the weight of brotherhood pressing on his chest. He made his decision in a single breath, slung his rifle across his chest and crawled toward the burning shack. The fourth round landed so close that the concussion punched the air from his lungs. Dirt rained down, pebbles stung his neck, but he kept moving. Inside, the heat was unbearable. Torres was already dragging one man out by his vest, his face blackened from soot. Miller was bent over the second casualty, blood soaking through his sleeves as he pulled the soldier free. Together they got them out just as another round crashed on the far side of the outpost, sending a cascade of shrapnel whistling past. "Medics! Now!" Miller roared. The medics dove in, working furiously on the wounded as the rest of the squad returned fire. Tracers ripped into the dark ridgeline where the enemy spotters were thought to be hiding. The firefight was chaos. One moment pure instinct, the next calculated decision. Hayes took a knee behind a sandbag wall, firing controlled bursts. He thought he saw movement in the rocks, squeezed the trigger and saw sparks. Whether it was metal, stone, or man he didn't know. The mortars stopped as abruptly as they began. The silence afterward was almost more terrifying, broken only by the crackle of flames and the groans of the wounded. The squad kept their weapons trained on the ridges, waiting, but no further attack came. Just silence, thick and heavy. When it was clear the barrage was over, Miller did a head count. 2 wounded, 1 critical, both evacuated by bird an hour later. The rest alive but shaken. Hayes sat against a wall, rifle across his lap, hands trembling. He tried to steady his breathing, but the images replayed. The fire, the screams, the decision to run toward it instead of away. He felt both sick and strangely alive, a cocktail of fear and pride burning through him. That night, the squad gathered in the dim light of the mess hut, what was left of it. The air smelled of burned wood and singed electronics. No one spoke at first. The war had a way of stealing words. But eventually Torres broke the silence with a dry laugh. "You're out of your damn mind, Hayes. Running in there like you thought you were Superman." "Look who's talking," Hayes muttered, managing a grin. Miller's eyes were on them both. "You made the right call," he said simply, though his tone was flat, unreadable. "But right calls don't make it easier. Remember that." They all nodded. In war, the line between courage and stupidity was razor thin, but Brotherhood didn't care about definitions. They'd pulled their men out. That was what mattered. 2 days later, the colonel arrived. A stiff, clean uniform type who never left the FOB, he stepped into the battered compound like he was inspecting a factory floor. He had no dust on his boots, no burn marks on his sleeves. His eyes scanned the squad with faint disapproval, like their soot-streaked faces were an inconvenience. "I've read the reports," the colonel began, voice cold, detached. "A mortar strike, poor response time, and unnecessary risks taken. Is that about the sum of it?" Torres bristled. "Unnecessary? Sir, we dragged our guys out alive." The colonel cut him off with a raised hand. "What I see are mistakes. Running into an active strike zone? That's reckless. That's how you lose more men." Silence fell. Hayes felt the weight of the words pressing down. He wanted to shout back to explain what it meant in that moment, but his voice caught in his throat. Then a woman's voice rose from the corner. "Sir, with respect, you weren't there." All heads turned. It was Staff Sergeant Daniels. She'd been quiet since the attack, her sleeves rolled down despite the heat, her face unreadable. The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Daniels said evenly. "We made decisions that kept this squad alive. If you think that was reckless, maybe you've forgotten what it's like outside the wire." A tense silence filled the hut. The colonel smirked, almost condescending. "And what's your excuse, Sergeant? Nerves? Fatigue? Poor judgment? Or just plain hero?" Daniels didn't flinch. Slowly she tugged her sleeve up to the elbow. Jagged scars crisscrossed her forearm, raw reminders of shrapnel tearing flesh years before. She raised her arm, letting the room see. "My excuse," she said quietly, "is that I've been under fire before. I know what hesitation costs." The room went dead still. Even the colonel's smug expression faltered for a second. No one moved, no one breathed. The scars said more than words ever could. Finally, the colonel cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably. "Very well. Carry on." He left as abruptly as he'd come, his boots crunching on gravel outside. The squad sat in silence for a long moment before Torres let out a low whistle. "Guess that shut him up." A few chuckles rippled through the room, cutting the tension. Even Hayes smiled, though the weight of the night still pressed on his chest. The scars, the screams, the fire, they weren't leaving him anytime soon. But neither was the memory of Daniels standing up, scars bared, silencing the room with the truth of what it meant to be a soldier. As the squad finally settled into an uneasy rest, Hayes lay awake staring at the ceiling. The attack had been just one night, one decision, one brush with death. But he knew more would come. Out here there was no such thing as safe. Every day was a choice between fear and action, hesitation and survival. He wondered if he'd always have the courage to choose the right one. The war wasn't finished with him yet. The desert morning came too early, as it always did. The sun hadn't even broken the horizon when Sergeant Miller was shaking the squad. Awake, his voice carrying the edge of urgency that left no room for argument. Hayes blinked against the grit in his eyes, dragging himself out of his sleeping bag and reaching for his vest before his brain even caught up. The compound still smelled of smoke from the mortar strike 2 nights earlier, and black scorch marks scarred the walls like permanent reminders of what had happened. They were being sent back out. Orders came down fast, clipped, and without explanation. The squad was to patrol the ridgeline east of the valley, sweep for enemy spotters, and collect intel on where the mortars had been fired from. A search and destroy mission, though no one said it out loud. Everyone already knew. Hayes strapped his helmet and checked his rifle. He'd cleaned it twice in the last 24 hours, more out of nervous energy than necessity. Now the metal felt heavy in his hands, like it knew what was coming. Torres gave him a nudge as they lined up at the gate. "Ready for your morning jog through hell?" Torres muttered with a crooked grin. Ace tried to smirk back but failed. "As ready as I'll ever be." The gate opened and they stepped out into the dawn, boots crunching against the dirt. The mountains loomed above them, jagged silhouettes against the pale sky. Every rock, every shadow looked like it could be hiding something, or someone. The patrol moved slow, methodical, eyes scanning the ridges. Miller walked point, calm and deliberate, his presence steadying even when nothing else was. Daniels was a few paces back, her gaze sharp, every movement precise. Hayes found himself watching her more than the terrain, not out of distraction but out of instinct. She carried herself like someone who'd survived too much to be rattled by the ordinary threats. She saw something he wanted to see it too. An hour passed with nothing but the sound of boots and labored breathing. The sun climbed higher, burning away the coolness of dawn and replacing it with dry heat. Sweat trickled down Hayes' spine beneath his armor. Then Daniels froze. She raised a fist, the universal signal to stop. The squad dropped into a crouch, rifles snapping up, eyes searching. "Talk to me," Miller whispered. Daniels pointed toward a cluster of rocks halfway up the ridge. "Glint," she murmured. Hayes squinted. At first he saw nothing, just stone and dust. Then a flash, brief like sunlight bouncing off glass. A scope. "Contact 2 o'clock." Miller barked. The hillside erupted. Rifle fire cracked down at them, bullets whining off rocks and slamming into the dirt. The squad dove for cover, returning fire in bursts. Hayes pressed himself behind a boulder, heart hammering as rounds snapped overhead. He leaned out just enough to fire a controlled 3-round burst toward the ridge. Suppressing fire. Torres shouted, his saw spitting a stream of rounds that chewed into the hillside. Dust and rock chips exploded in the air. Miller's voice cut through the chaos. Daniels, Hayes, you're with me. We're flanking right. Torres, keep their heads down. Hayes didn't think. He moved. The three of them sprinted low along the ridge, bullets chasing their heels. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but adrenaline pushed him forward. They reached a shallow gully and dropped into it, hidden from view. Up that draw, Miller panted, pointing. We'll come around behind him. They climbed, scrambling on hands and knees, rocks sliding underfoot. Every step was a fight against gravity and fear. Hayes's mouth was dry as sand, his throat raw. All he could hear was his heartbeat hammering in his ears. When they crested the ridge, the enemy was in sight. 3 figures crouched behind rocks, rifles braced. They hadn't seen the flank. Miller raised his hand. 3 fingers. 2. 1. They opened fire. The ambush turned on itself in seconds. One enemy dropped instantly, another scrambled to return fire but went down under Daniels's controlled burst. The third bolted, sprinting up the slope. Hayes tracked him, finger tight on the trigger. He hesitated a split second, long enough to see the man's face, young, scared, no older than Hayes himself. The hesitation nearly killed him. The runner whipped around, firing wildly. Bullets kicked up dirt inches from Hayes's boots. Hayes snapped out of it and fired. The man crumpled mid-stride, rolling down the rocks. Hayes's stomach turned, bile rising in his throat. He'd fired before, returned fire in the heat of chaos, but this was different. He'd seen the face. He'd seen the fear. You good? Daniels's voice cut through, steady, grounding. Hayes nodded stiffly, though his hands were trembling. Yeah, I'm good. Then stay sharp. We're not done yet. The squad regrouped on the ridge. Torres and the others had pushed forward during the distraction, and the firing had stopped. 3 enemy spotters neutralized, no casualties on their side. By the numbers, it was a success. But Hayes couldn't shake the image of the young fighter's face. He'd pulled the trigger, ended a life, and the weight of it sat heavy in his chest. Back at the outpost, the squad reported in. The colonel wasn't there this time, just a captain who nodded curtly and scribbled notes. Hayes barely registered the debrief. His mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment over and over. That night, he sat alone by the sandbag wall, staring out at the mountains. Torres found him there, plopping down with his usual easy grin, though his eyes carried the same exhaustion everyone else wore. Hell of a day, huh? Torres said. Hayes didn't answer at first. Finally, he muttered, he couldn't have been much older than me. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he shrugged, lighting a cigarette. Doesn't matter how old they are, man. If they're pointing a rifle at you, age don't mean shit. Hayes shook his head. I hesitated. Almost got myself killed. Yeah, but you didn't. And you pulled the trigger when it counted. Torres exhaled a cloud of smoke, eyes hard now. Don't get stuck in your head about it. That's how you make mistakes next time. Hayes wanted to believe him. But as the night dragged on, the unease didn't fade. 2 days later, orders came again. This time, a village sweep. Intel suggested the mortar crew had staged from a cluster of mud brick houses at the base of the valley. The squad was to search, question, and if necessary, detain. It wasn't the kind of mission anyone liked. Combat was simple, enemy on that ridge, take them out. Villages were different. Villages were complicated. They rolled out in Humvees at dawn, dust clouds trailing behind. The village appeared as a smudge on the horizon, then grew into a cluster of low walls and narrow alleys. Children scattered as the convoy approached, eyes wide, shouts echoing in the air. Women pulled shawls tighter around themselves, watching from doorways. Men stood in small groups, their faces unreadable. The squad dismounted, weapons ready but lowered. Miller's voice was calm, deliberate. Rules of engagement. Eyes open, fingers off triggers unless you have to. We're here for information, not a firefight. They moved through the narrow streets, searching houses one by one. Most were empty, just rugs, cooking pots, and the smell of smoke. In one they found a cache of radios and spare batteries. In another, fresh mortar tail fins buried under straw. The evidence was clear. The village had been used. But by who? And did the villagers have a choice? Hayes watched Daniels question an elder, her Pashto fluent, her tone respectful but firm. The old man swore they knew nothing, that strangers had forced their way in, used their homes, and left. His eyes, though, told a more complicated story. Fear, guilt, resignation. Torres muttered to Hayes, same story every time. They're either lying or too scared to tell the truth. Hayes frowned. And we're supposed to figure out which in 5 minutes? Before Torres could answer, shouting erupted from the far end of the street. Two men were running, bolting from a doorway. The squad reacted instantly. "Stop. Hands up," Miller shouted. The men kept running. Shots rang out, warning shots at first, then lethal as one of the runners reached for something at his belt. He went down hard. The other stumbled to a stop, hands raised, fear etched on his face. The squad swarmed him, zip-tying his wrists, searching his clothes. They found a radio, fresh dirt on his boots, and a folded map marked with grid coordinates. Miller studied it grimly. "Mortar positions," he muttered. "This is it." The man was dragged to the Humvee, still shouting in a language Hayes didn't understand. The villagers watched in silence, eyes burning with something between fear and hatred. On the ride back, the squad was quiet. The mission had been a success by the book. They'd found evidence, captured a suspect, shut down the mortar threat. But Hayes couldn't shake the image of the villagers' faces, the children staring as their father, uncle, or brother was taken away. That night he found himself beside Daniels. She was cleaning her rifle in the low light, movement steady, precise. "How do you deal with it?" Hayes asked quietly. She looked up, her eyes unreadable. "Deal with what?" "The faces, the decisions, all of it." She paused, setting the rifle aside. "You don't deal with it." "Not really. You carry it. Some days it's lighter, some days heavier. But you carry it because if you don't, someone else will have to. And maybe they won't come back." Hayes nodded slowly. Her words settled in his chest, heavy but steadying. The war wasn't about clean victories or simple answers. It was about carrying weight, making choices, living with them. And tomorrow there would be more choices to make. Sleep was rare and shallow. Hayes woke in the middle of the night to the sound of rotor blades thumping the air. A medevac bird was lifting off from the landing pad, its red light sweeping across the compound. Another casualty, though he didn't know from which unit. The sound faded into the night, leaving only the low hum of the generator and the restless churn of his own thoughts. He rubbed his eyes and tried to drift back under, but his brain wouldn't stop replaying the last patrol, the boy's terrified face before he pulled the trigger, the villagers watching them haul away the prisoner. By morning, orders had already shifted. The suspect they'd captured broke during interrogation, or maybe decided to trade survival for information. Either way, he gave up a location, a cave system tucked into the cliffs north of the valley. It was supposedly a weapons cache and staging point for the mortar teams. Command wanted it neutralized. The squad was called to the TOC for briefing. A map was pinned on the board, red circles scribbled around the coordinates. The mission was clear: air insertion, sweep the caves, destroy weapons, exfil. "High chance of contact," Miller said, his finger tracing the ridgeline. "Don't expect to stroll in and out. We'll be facing fighters who know those caves better than we know our own outpost. Stay sharp, stay tight. No freelancing." Torres leaned over to Hayes and muttered, "Translation, this is gonna suck." Hayes gave a thin smile but said nothing. He could feel the nervous energy radiating through the squad. Everyone knew cave sweeps were messy. Tight spaces, limited sight lines, no room to maneuver. It was a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. They loaded onto the Chinook at dawn, rotors chopping the cool morning air. The valley shrank beneath them, replaced by jagged cliffs and winding dry riverbeds. Hayes sat wedged between Torres and Daniels, rifle across his lap, trying not to think about the dark holes they were about to descend into. The bird flared into a clearing at the base of the cliffs. Dust and grit whipped into their faces as they spilled out, crouching low until the Chinook lifted away. The sudden silence afterward felt unnatural. "Form up," Miller ordered, his voice low but steady. They moved toward the cliffs, eyes scanning every crevice. The first cave mouth yawned open ahead, dark and uninviting. Miller raised his fist to halt the squad. "Torres, Hayes, you're on point. Daniels, you're with me behind them. Let's go." Hayes's throat went dry. Point meant first through the door, first into the unknown. He nodded anyway, tightening his grip on the rifle. They stacked at the entrance, night vision goggles flipped down. Torres gave him a quick grin. "After you, hero." Hayes swallowed hard, took a breath and stepped inside. The air shifted immediately, cool, damp, carrying the faint stench of rot and smoke. The walls closed in, rough stone scraping against his vest. He moved carefully, rifle raised, eyes scanning through the green haze of NVGs. Every drip of water, every shuffle of boots echoed louder than it should. They advanced deeper, the tunnel splitting into two passages. Miller signaled right and they moved as a unit. The silence was oppressive, heavy. Hayes's nerves were stretched thin, waiting for the inevitable. It came fast. Gunfire erupted from the darkness ahead, muzzle flashes strobing in the black. Bullets ricocheted off stone, sparks lighting the walls. Hayes dropped to a knee, firing back, the sound deafening in the confined space. Torres's saw thundered beside him, the barrel glowing as he poured rounds downrange. "Frag out!" Daniels shouted, lobbing a grenade into the tunnel. The explosion rocked the walls, dust and smoke filling the air. Screams echoed, then cut short. "Push up!" Miller barked. They surged forward, stepping over debris and blood. The tunnel widened into a cavern, firelight flickering off crude lanterns. Wooden crates and metal cases were stacked against the walls, ammo, rockets, mortar tubes. And bodies, some still twitching, sprawled on the dirt. Torres kicked one of the crates open, whistling low. "Jackpot. Enough ordnance here to level half the valley." "Set charges," Miller ordered. "We're not leaving this for them." They worked quickly, planting C4 along the stacks. Hayes's hands shook as he rigged the explosives, adrenaline still surging. He tried not to look at the faces of the dead, but his eyes betrayed him. One was barely older than 16, a patchy beard on his jaw. The kid's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. Hayes turned away while burning his throat. "Hayes." Miller's voice snapped him back. "Focus. Charges secure?" "Yeah, Sarge. Secure." "Good. Let's move." They pushed deeper, clearing tunnels one by one. Resistance flared, short and brutal. Fighters darted from shadows, firing wildly before being cut down. A bullet grazed Torres's helmet, knocking him flat, but he sprang up swearing, blood trickling down his temple. Daniels took a round to her vest, the impact slamming her against the wall, but she recovered, grimacing. Every decision mattered. Shoot or hold fire. Advance or fall back. Hesitate and someone died. Hayes felt the weight of it pressing harder with every step. Finally they reached the far chamber. It was larger than the rest, the ceiling high enough to vanish into darkness. In the center was a makeshift command post, maps, radios and a laptop humming faintly on a table. Miller's eyes narrowed. "Grab everything. Intel comes first." Hayes slung the laptop while Torres scooped up maps. Daniels covered the entrance, her rifle steady. That's when Hayes heard it, a faint click beneath his boot. He froze. Slowly he looked down. A thin wire stretched taut under his foot, disappearing into a crude pressure plate. His stomach dropped. "Don't move," Daniels said sharply, eyes locking on his. Hayes's breath came fast, chest tight. "It's a trap," he whispered. Miller crouched, eyes scanning the device. "Looks like a dead man switch. Step off and it goes boom." Sweat trickled down Hayes's back. His legs trembled, every muscle screaming to move, but he forced himself still. "What do I do?" "Stay calm," Miller said, voice low and steady. "Daniels, Torres, clear the room. Everyone out now." "No way," Torres snapped. "We're not leaving him." "That's an order." Miller barked. The squad hesitated, torn between loyalty and survival. Finally they backed out, leaving Hayes alone with Miller. The cavern felt suffocating now, the silence pressing in. Miller studied the plate, muttering under his breath. "Crude. Homemade. Could be disarmed if..." A burst of gunfire echoed from the tunnels outside, followed by shouting. The enemy wasn't finished. Miller swore. "Hayes, listen to me. I can cut this, but I need time." "We don't have time," Hayes said, panic rising. "Then you buy us some. Hold steady. If I screw this up, we both go." Hayes clenched his jaw, forcing himself to breathe. He thought of the faces of his squad, of Danielle's scars, of Torres's easy grin. He thought of what hesitation had cost him before. "Not this time." "Do it," he said. Miller's hands moved fast, knife flashing as he sliced wires, eyes focused. Sweat dripped down his forehead. Hayes felt every heartbeat like a countdown. Then snip. The tension under his boot vanished. Miller exhaled sharply. "Clear. Move." They bolted from the chamber, sprinting through the tunnels. Explosions echoed behind them as charges detonated, fire consuming the cache. The shockwave chased them out into daylight, a plume of smoke rising from the cave mouth. The squad regrouped outside, coughing, covered in dust but alive. "Everyone up?" Miller called. "All here," Daniels confirmed, her eyes flicking to Hayes. Torres clapped him on the back. "Hell of a dance move you pulled in there." Hayes managed a weak laugh, though his legs were still trembling. "Next time you take point." The relief was short-lived. More gunfire crackled from the cliffs above. Dozens of fighters appeared, pouring fire down into the clearing. They'd walked straight into an ambush. Contact. Get to cover. Miller shouted. Bullets kicked up dirt around them, snapping through the air. The squad dove behind rocks, returning fire. Hayes pressed his cheek against the stock, firing controlled bursts, but there were too many. Dust and smoke filled the air, the sound of gunfire deafening. Radio for extract. Miller yelled. Daniels keyed the mic, shouting coordinates into the static. Hayes caught fragments. Enemy strength, urgent, danger close. The answer came back. Birds inbound, 5 minutes. 5 minutes might as well have been 5 hours. The enemy pressed harder, rounds hammering their cover. Torres cursed as his saw jammed, fumbling with the belt. Hayes leaned out to cover him, firing until his magazine clicked empty. He slammed in a fresh mag with shaking hands. Then Daniels went down. A burst of gunfire caught her in the leg, knocking her flat. She gritted her teeth, dragging herself behind a rock. Blood soaked her pants, dark and spreading. Daniels is hit. Hayes shouted. I'm fine, she snapped, voice tight with pain. Keep firing. Hayes crawled to her side anyway, ripping open his IFAK. He pressed gauze against the wound, tying a tourniquet tight above her thigh. She hissed through her teeth but didn't stop firing, her rifle steady even as sweat poured down her face. Birds inbound. Miller shouted. The distant thump of rotor blades grew louder. 2 Apaches swept in, spitting rockets into the cliffs. Explosions tore through the rocks, scattering fighters like ants. The Chinook thundered in low, kicking up a storm of dust. Go, 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 Miller ordered. The squad sprinted, dragging Daniels between them. Hayes fired backward blindly, covering their retreat as they scrambled into the bird. The ramp slammed shut, and the Chinook lifted, tracer fire chasing them into the sky. Inside, the squad collapsed against the metal walls, chests heaving. Daniels lay pale but conscious, her jaw clenched against the pain. Hayes sat beside her, blood streaked across his hands. You held it together, she muttered, voice hoarse but steady. That's what matters. Hayes swallowed hard, nodding. For the first time he believed it. But as the Chinook roared toward the horizon, smoke rising from the caves below, he knew the war wasn't finished with any of them. Not by a long shot. The night air in the valley was heavy with the scent of dust and smoke, but Sergeant Elena Torres barely noticed. Her hands were clenched tight around the stock of her rifle, her knuckles white as the convoy rumbled slowly through the treacherous mountain pass. She sat on the side of the lead Humvee, her eyes scanning the jagged cliffs above. Every shadow looked like the silhouette of an enemy fighter. Every crevice seemed deep enough to hide an IED. The firefight at the village still echoed in her mind. The scream of a mortar, the sudden burst of gunfire, the smell of burning rubber and flesh. They had survived, but survival was becoming a temporary condition out here. The Taliban wasn't going away, and she knew every trip deeper into these mountains meant dancing closer to the edge of death. Sergeant, you good? Private Jenkins' voice cracked through the silence from the turret above. Eyes forward, Jenkins, she barked, but there was no anger in her tone. Just focus. Jenkins was young, green, and still believed he was indestructible. That belief would vanish the first time shrapnel tore through his armor. She didn't want it to be tonight. The convoy rounded a bend, engines groaning under the strain. Torres's instincts screamed at her. Something about the silence felt wrong. Not the usual wrong, the kind that meant enemy fighters were moving unseen. This was the kind of silence that meant the entire valley was holding its breath. She raised her fist. Halt. The convoy ground to a stop. Dust swirled around them. Lieutenant Monroe leaned out from the second Humvee. What the hell are we stopping for, Torres? We've got 30 clicks to cover before sunup. Doesn't feel right, Torres replied. Monroe scoffed. Since when does doesn't feel right make it into the field manual? Before Torres could answer, Jenkins' turret-mounted .50 cal roared to life. The mountain face above them lit up as muzzle flashes flared. Bullets pinged and cracked off armor plating. The ambush had begun. Contact. 12 o'clock high. Jenkins shouted. The night erupted. RPGs streaked down like flaming arrows. One slammed into the third Humvee, blowing it onto its side in a spray of fire and metal. Screams pierced the chaos. Torres dove behind a boulder, her rifle barking into the darkness. She couldn't see their attackers clearly, just shifting shapes against the ridgeline, but her rounds snapped them back into cover. Jenkins' gun chewed the cliff apart, spraying chunks of rock into the night, but the enemy kept pressing. Get that truck upright. Monroe yelled into the comms. His voice was strained but steady. We've got wounded inside. Torres cursed. She could already see the twisted wreckage, flames licking up through the undercarriage. Time was running out. She sprinted across open ground, bullets kicking dirt at her boots. She slammed against the overturned Humvee, grabbed the handle and yanked. Inside, Corporal Hayes was pinned, his leg crushed beneath the warped frame. His helmet was cracked, his eyes wild with pain. "Don't you die on me, Hayes?" Torres growled, bracing herself. She wedged her shoulder under the door and heaved. The metal groaned, shifted an inch, then slammed back down. "Torres, pull out." Monroe's order snapped in her earpiece. "That truck's gonna blow." "No chance," she muttered. "Not leaving him." She grabbed Hayes by his vest, yanked, and felt something give. With a scream, she dragged him free, hauling him onto her back. Her legs burned as she sprinted back toward cover. Behind them, the Humvee detonated, a fireball lighting the night sky. The blast hurled them forward. Torres landed hard, shielding Hayes with her body as debris rained down. She tasted blood in her mouth. Her ears rang. But Hayes was still alive beneath her, gasping in pain. "Medic," she shouted hoarsely. Specialist Rivera slid to her side, already pulling bandages and tourniquets from his pack. "Got him, Sergeant?" Torres staggered upright, rifle still in hand. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind was ice. She turned back to the fight. The ambush wasn't over. If anything, it was getting worse. Enemy fighters were swarming down the ridgeline now, trying to overwhelm them before reinforcements could arrive. Torres dropped 3 with precise bursts, each one falling like a marionette with cut strings. But for every fighter that fell, 2 more seemed to appear. Monroe's voice crackled again. "Torres, flank right. Take pressure off Jenkins' gun." She didn't hesitate. Sliding into the shadows, she cut across the rocky slope, moving low and fast. Her boots crunched gravel, her breath loud in her helmet. She crested a ridge and came face to face with 2 insurgents. They froze for a split second, as shocked as she was. Then both raised their rifles. Torres was faster. Her shots cracked and both men crumpled. She pushed past them, adrenaline surging through her veins. The firefight thundered below, but she had no time to think about fear or exhaustion. This was survival, pure, brutal survival. By the time she circled back, Jenkins' turret had gone quiet. Torres' heart sank. She sprinted toward the Humvee, bullets snapping past her. Jenkins was slumped over the gun, blood soaking his vest. She scrambled up, yanking him down. His eyes flickered open. "Surge," he whispered, his lips pale. Did I get him?" "You got plenty," she said, her throat tight. "You did good, Jenkins. Real good." But even as she spoke, his chest stilled. The life left his eyes. For a moment, Torres couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. He had been just a kid. A damn kid who thought he was indestructible. Monroe's voice cut through her grief like a blade. "Pull back. Regroup. Air support is inbound." Torres wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and picked up Jenkins' weapon. The heavy gun roared once more, spitting fire into the ridgeline. She poured every ounce of rage, grief, and fury into that trigger. The enemy fighters faltered, broke, and began retreating into the night. Minutes later, the rumble of Apache helicopters thundered overhead. Rockets streaked into the cliffs, detonating with earth-shaking force. The ambush was broken. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was hollow. Torres climbed down, her arms trembling. She looked at the bodies laid out on the ground, Hayes still breathing but broken. Rivera working frantically on another wounded soldier. And Jenkins covered with a poncho, his boyish face forever stilled. Monroe approached, his jaw clenched. "We lost 3. Jenkins, Ortiz, and Michaels. Hayes is critical. Rest of us, we're alive." "Barely." Torres nodded, but her throat burned with words she couldn't speak. She wanted to scream at him for pushing the convoy forward. She wanted to scream at herself for not seeing the ambush sooner. But none of it mattered now. The dead didn't care about blame. Hours later they were back at base. The medics rushed Hayes into surgery. The rest of the platoon sat in the dim mess hall, silent, their food untouched. Monroe stood at the front, trying to find words. "We held the line tonight. We saved the convoy. That matters. You all fought like warriors and I'm proud." His voice cracked on the last word. He sat down heavily, staring at the table. Torres looked around at the weary faces. The weight of command wasn't just his, it was hers too. Every decision, every hesitation, every gut call carried lives in its balance. She thought of Jenkins' last words, of his smile before the ambush, and felt her chest tighten. When she finally stood, the room lifted their eyes to her. "We keep going," she said softly. For Jenkins. For Ortiz. For Michaels. We don't let their names get lost in the dust. We carry them with us. Always. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. It wasn't victory, but it was strength. Later that night, Torres sat alone outside the barracks, staring at the desert stars. The mountains loomed in the distance, shadows against the sky. She felt small beneath them, smaller than she ever had. But she also felt something else. Resolve. This war was far from over. And tomorrow the valley would be waiting again. The base was too quiet. Sergeant Elena Torres walked down the narrow corridor of the field hospital, her boots echoing against the tile. The air smelled of antiseptic and blood, of lives held together with gauze and stubborn will. Hayes was in one of the rooms. She hadn't visited him yet, not because she didn't care, but because she couldn't stand the look he would give her. The look that asked why me when she had no answer. She pushed through the double doors and found him lying pale on the bed, his right leg gone from the knee down. Tubes ran into his arms. His eyes lit faintly when he saw her. "Serge," he rasped, his voice weak. "Guess I'm done running PT, huh?" Torres forced a smirk. "About damn time. You were slowing me down anyway." He chuckled, then winced. The sound twisted in her gut. "I should have seen it coming," he muttered. "That IED was right there." I froze. Torres shook her head firmly. "Don't you dare put this on yourself. You fought. You held out until we got you out. That's what matters. The rest, that's war. Nobody gets out clean." Hayes closed his eyes. Jenkins didn't get out at all. The silence pressed between them. She wanted to tell him Jenkins had died a hero, that his last thought was victory. But the truth sat heavy in her chest. Jenkins died asking if he'd done enough. "I'll make sure he's remembered," Torres said quietly. "All of them. That's my promise." Hayes nodded, tears sliding from the corners of his eyes. Torres squeezed his hand once, then left before he saw her own tears forming. Outside, the sun was blazing, but she felt cold. The debrief that afternoon was brutal. The room was filled with brass: Colonel Barrett, Captain Green, and Monroe. Torres stood at the back, her arms crossed, jaw locked. Barrett slammed a file onto the table. 3 Kia. 1 critical. A Humvee destroyed. You want me to tell Washington that was success? Monroe tried to hold his ground. "Sir, we were ambushed by a superior force. We adapted, held the line, and completed the mission. Without Torres spotting the danger, casualties would have been double." Barrett's eyes shifted toward her. "That true, Sergeant? You saw something before it happened." Torres met his gaze without flinching. "It was instinct. The valley went too quiet. I called the halt." Barrett studied her, then leaned back. "Instinct doesn't show up in reports. What shows up are dead men. So tell me, Sergeant, why didn't you stop the ambush?" The words hit like a slap. Torres' fists tightened. "With respect, sir, I did everything I could. We all did. If you want to blame someone, blame the enemy for setting the trap." The room went still. Barrett's glare burned, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he gave a cold smile. "Bold. You've got fire, Sergeant. Just make sure it doesn't get your people burned next time." The meeting ended with new orders: patrols deeper into the valley. The brass wanted to reassert control, to prove they weren't cowed by ambushes. Torres left the room sick to her stomach. They were sending her people back into the grinder. 2 nights later, the platoon prepared to move out. The mood was tense, quieter than usual. Jenkins' empty bunk still sat in the corner, untouched. Ortiz's helmet remained on the shelf where he'd left it. Michael's letters home were stacked neatly, waiting for someone to send them to his family. Torres gathered the squad. "Listen up. We're heading out again, but we don't fight the last fight twice. We stay sharp. We watch the ridges, we watch the ground, and we watch each other. Nobody goes home in a bag. Not if I can help it." Rivera raised a hand. "What about command, Sergeant? They're pushing us into the same valley. Feels like they want a show." "Then we show them," Torres replied. "Not with body counts. With survival. That's the only kind of win that matters right now." The soldiers nodded. Some looked scared. Some looked angry. But all of them looked at her. Not Monroe. Not the brass. Her. The valley was darker this time, the moon hidden behind clouds. The convoy moved slower, tighter. Every pair of eyes scanned the cliffs. The silence was oppressive. Halfway through, Torres lifted a fist. "Halt." Monroe leaned forward. "Again?" "Again," she said firmly. "Something's wrong." The radio crackled. "Command demanding status." Monroe gave a clipped response, but Torres ignored him. She crouched low, studying the ground. The dirt was disturbed. Fresh. Too fresh. "ID right side," she whispered. She traced the wire with her eyes, thin, nearly invisible, leading toward a cluster of rocks. Her stomach twisted. "Rivera Market. Everyone else back up 50 meters. Now." They moved quickly. Rivera placed a small infrared marker for the engineers who'd come later. As they pulled back, Torres noticed movement on the ridge. Shadows darting. "Contact," she shouted. Gunfire exploded. The convoy lit up the ridge with tracers. RPGs whooshed overhead, one slamming into the dirt short of the lead Humvee. The blast rocked the earth, showering them with debris. Torres returned fire, dropping a fighter who tried to reposition with an RPG. The firefight was fierce, but this time they were ready. Jenkins' replacement on the turret, Private Daniels, roared with fury, mowing down targets with deadly precision. Still the enemy pressed hard. Monroe barked into the radio for support, but air cover was 10 minutes out. 10 minutes felt like forever. Torres spotted a group of insurgents flanking along a gully. "With me," she yelled, grabbing Rivera and two others. They sprinted across open ground, bullets snapping around them. Sliding into cover, they unleashed fire down the gully, cutting the flank off before it reached the convoy. Rivera grinned through the chaos. "Not today, assholes." Torres smirked despite herself. "Keep talking, you'll jinx us." They held until the Apaches arrived. Rockets screamed into the ridgeline, scattering the remaining fighters. Within minutes, the valley was silent again, except for the pounding of their hearts. This time they'd taken no casualties. A miracle. Back at base, Monroe approached Torres quietly. "You saved us again. I'll give you that. The colonel may not see it, but I do." Torres nodded. "Doesn't matter if he sees it. What matters is they made it back." She glanced at her squad, battered but alive. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. That night, she sat alone outside the barracks, staring at the desert stars. Her body was exhausted, but her mind raced. She thought of Jenkins, Ortiz, Michaels, Hayes. She thought of the brass demanding numbers on paper. She thought of the men and women beside her, trusting her with their lives. The war wasn't ending. The missions weren't stopping. But something inside her had shifted. She wasn't just fighting the enemy anymore. She was fighting the system that treated her people like expendable pieces on a chessboard. And she swore to herself, if the brass wanted to use her platoon as bait, they'd have to go through her first. The desert wind whispered across the valley, carrying the smell of smoke and dust. Torres tightened her grip on her rifle. Tomorrow would come. And when it did, she'd be ready. The next morning, the desert shimmered under a merciless sun. Dust clung to every surface, coating skin, rifles, and helmets with the same gritty film. Sergeant Elena Torres sat in the motor pool, her back against a tire taller than she was. Her rifle lay across her lap, cleaned and oiled. The routine usually calmed her. Today it did nothing. The night's firefight replayed over and over in her mind. The ridge lit by tracer fire. Jenkins' empty seat in the turret. Hayes' torn body. Command demanding reports instead of sending reinforcements. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pressing behind them. She hadn't slept. Not because she couldn't, but because she didn't want to. Sleep meant dreams, and dreams meant watching her soldiers die again. Footsteps approached. Lieutenant Monroe crouched down beside her. His uniform was as dusty as hers, his eyes just as hollow. "You ever wonder," he muttered, "if the brass even remembers what it feels like out there? The dirt, the noise, the smell of your own sweat when you're praying you'll live long enough to reload." Torres gave a humorless laugh. "Barrett doesn't. To him we're dots on a map. Move the dots forward, erase the dots if they fall. Doesn't matter. There's always more dots." Monroe sighed. "Well, we're about to be moved again. Orders just came down." Torres tensed. "Another valley run? Worse." Monroe pulled out a folded map. "We're to take a high ridge overlooking the border. Intelligence says insurgents are using it as a staging ground. We're to seize and hold until reinforcements arrive." Torres studied the map. The ridge was exposed, surrounded by higher ground. It was a death trap. "That's insane. They'll pin us down in minutes. Reinforcements will never make it." "Tell that to Barrett," Monroe said bitterly. "We leave at dawn." When Torres briefed her squad that evening, the reactions were immediate: anger, disbelief, fear. Rivera slammed his helmet down. Daniels cursed under his breath. Shoulder as her eyes scanned the ridges beyond. The day's skirmish had cost them dearly, and now the insurgents had pulled back, only to regroup. Everyone knew the next wave was coming. No one knew when. She stopped near a sandbag wall where Private Ross was checking the feed on the mounted .50 cal. His hands shook though he tried to hide it. "You good?" she asked. He gave a half smile but his voice betrayed him. "Just peachy, Sergeant. Can't wait to see what fireworks they got for us tonight." Alvarez nodded. She didn't bother sugarcoating things anymore. "Stay sharp. Don't waste a single round unless you have a clear target. Ammo's thin." "Roger that." As she moved on, she could feel the eyes of her squad following her. She had become something more than their sergeant. She was the anchor that kept them from slipping into chaos. Every decision she made carried the weight of their survival, and she felt it in her chest with every step. At command, the colonel sat at the map table under the glow of a single lantern. The lines etched across his face looked deeper than ever. He looked up as Alvarez entered. "Report. Patrol perimeters secure. Men are set on rotations. We've got maybe 3 belts left for the .50s, half a crate of grenades, and enough small arms to hold for a night." "Maybe." The colonel frowned. "They're testing us. I can feel it. Tomorrow they'll come hard." Alvarez glanced at the map, then at him. "They know we're isolated. If reinforcements don't arrive soon, it won't matter how many times we hold them off." He rubbed his temple, then met her gaze. "Sergeant, if this post falls, the entire valley opens up. Every convoy route, every supply line, gone. That cannot happen. You understand me?" Alvarez didn't flinch. "Understood. But if we're making a stand, we'll need to be creative." The colonel studied her, as though searching for something in her scars, in her calm tone. He finally nodded. "Do what you have to. I trust your judgment." Those words carried weight. She left command with them echoing in her head, heavier than her rifle. By dawn, the mountains glowed a faint red, and with it came the first crack of a distant rifle. Ross shouted from the trench, "Contact, East Ridge." Chaos ignited. Gunfire poured across the valley, tracer rounds streaking through the rising light. Alvarez sprinted down the trench, shouting orders, pulling soldiers into firing positions. Dust kicked up with every impact around them. The insurgents came in waves, disciplined and relentless. "Focus fire on the left flank." Alvarez bellowed, pointing as mortar shells thudded into the ground, shaking dirt loose from the trench walls. A young private screamed as shrapnel tore into his arm. Alvarez dropped beside him, dragging him down, applying a tourniquet with practiced speed even as bullets whizzed overhead. "Stay with me, Miller." "You're not done yet," she growled, her hands slick with his blood. The boy nodded weakly, eyes glassy, but he held on. Alvarez passed him off to the medic and sprang up, emptying her mag into the advancing ridge. The hours blurred into blood, smoke and grit. By midday they'd pushed the enemy back again, but the cost was brutal. 3 dead. 8 wounded. The outpost reeked of cordite and burnt earth. The men slumped in exhaustion, faces hollow, but Alvarez forced herself to stand tall in front of them. "Listen up. You think they broke us? Hell no. We're still here and tomorrow we'll be here again. You hear me?" A weak cheer rose, not of celebration but defiance. That was enough. That night, the colonel found her sitting against a sandbag wall, cleaning her weapon. "You held them," he said quietly. "Barely," she replied. "We can't take another hit like that." He sank down beside her, a man visibly cracked under the pressure. "I mocked you once. Said your excuse was weakness." His voice caught. "But seeing you out there today, those scars don't make you weak. They make you the strongest damn soldier I've got." Alvarez didn't answer right away. She kept working the bolt on her M4, the rhythmic click steadying her thoughts. Finally she said, "Scars don't mean strength, Colonel. They just mean you survived long enough to earn them. The real strength is what you do after." He studied her for a long time then nodded. "Then tomorrow, Sergeant, we'll do what needs to be done." The radio crackled at that moment, sharp and unexpected. Alvarez snatched it up. A faint voice came through the static. "This is Eagle 6, reinforcements inbound. 2 days." Relief swept through the bunker like air to drowning lungs. 2 days. All they had to do was survive 2 more days. But Alvarez felt the weight of it instantly. 2 days might as well be 2 lifetimes in war. The insurgents knew reinforcements were coming. They wouldn't wait, they would throw everything they had at the outpost to crush it before help arrived. And in the quiet that followed the radio call, she knew the real fight hadn't even begun. The next day brought eerie stillness. No gunfire. No movement on the ridges. Just silence. The men grew restless, some whispering about being surrounded, others praying under their breath. Alvarez walked the perimeter, her eyes scanning the rocky horizon, every nerve screaming that something was wrong. Then as the sun dipped low, the mountains came alive. Dozens of enemy fighters poured down the slopes, RPGs streaking through the dusk, mortars slamming into the outpost. The ground shook as if the earth itself wanted them gone. Positions. Now. Alvarez shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. The battle that erupted was unlike any before. Every inch of the outpost was contested. Trenches filled with smoke and fire, the screams of the wounded mingling with the roar of automatic fire. Alvarez fought like a force of nature, rallying men, dragging ammo, pulling the wounded to cover. At one point, when the east wall began to buckle under RPG fire, she grabbed a law and fired it herself, the explosion tearing apart a cluster of enemy fighters before they could breach. By midnight the attack stalled, but at a cost that made Alvarez's chest ache. Too many were gone. The colonel staggered up to her, blood on his sleeve, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "One more day," he rasped. "We just need one more day." Alvarez looked over the battlefield, burning vehicles, shattered sandbags, the broken bodies of friends and enemies alike. Her hands shook as she reloaded her rifle, her jaw tight with grim determination. "One more day," she whispered back. But deep inside she wondered, when that final day came, would there be anyone left to save? The end.